It starts with laughter, the kind that fills a room so easily you forget how fragile it is. In the photos that still circulate online, little Rica Roundtree grins shyly at the camera, her hair tied back, her eyes wide and bright with that unmistakable light children carry before the world teaches them fear. To anyone looking, she was just another happy 8-year-old, a girl who loved her dolls, sang to herself while getting dressed, and clung to her mother's side like a shadow. But those same photos would later feel like evidence from another lifetime, snapshots of a child smiling for a world that refused to protect her. Behind that smile was a story that would expose one of the most shocking child abuse cases in Illinois history. Not just because of what happened to Rica, but because of how many chances there were to save her and how every single one slipped away. Her story isn't only about monsters hiding in plain sight. It's about systems built to protect children that too often look the other way, and about how silence, when multiplied by bureaucracy and indifference, can kill just as surely as violence itself. Before the headlines, before the outrage, before anyone knew her name, Rica was simply a daughter, a classmate, a bright, soft-spoken girl with an imagination that kept her company when the real world became too cruel. Her mother, Anjanetta Simmons, used to say that Rica wasn't just her child. She was her best friend. They did everything together. Grocery runs, afternoon walks, late-night dance parties in their small living room. Anjanetta worked hard to create stability, even when life pushed back, raising her kids on limited income but unlimited love. And yet, as it happens too often, one wrong decision would unravel everything. In 2016, trying to provide for her family amid mounting bills and an empty fridge, Anjanetta turned to selling illegal substances, not out of greed, but out of desperation. She was arrested later that year, and in that moment, the state saw a criminal, not a mother pleading for her children's safety. Her daughter Rica was placed into the custody of her biological father, Rica Roundtree, a man Anjanetta had long feared. "Don't send her there," she begged caseworkers. "Please, she won't be safe." But the system didn't listen. They looked at her record, not her instincts. They saw her as unfit, not as someone who knew what her child needed to survive. And so, in the eyes of Illinois child welfare officials, Rica Roundtree became the safer choice. What they didn't know, or worse, chose not to investigate, was that Richard's girlfriend, Cynthia Baker, already had a documented history of violence, including past allegations of abuse. And with that single decision, Rica's life entered its final chapter, a chapter written in warnings ignored, bruises unnoticed, and a growing silence that would one day speak louder than any cry for help ever could. When Rica Roundtree first arrived at her father's home, she still carried pieces of her old world with her, the pink backpack from her mother, the doll she tucked under her arm when she was nervous, and the fragile hope that she'd find love wherever she was sent. Children have this incredible ability to believe that adults will make things better. But what she didn't know, what no one had truly warned her about, was that the house she walked into wasn't a home. It was a trap. Richard Roundtree wasn't the kind of father she'd imagined. He was detached, stern, more focused on controlling the people around him than caring for them. And the woman he lived with, Cynthia Baker, was the kind of person whose cruelty didn't erupt all at once. It leaked slowly, poisoning every day until there was nothing left to save. At first, the abuse was disguised as discipline. Extra chores, long lectures, denial of dessert for small mistakes. But soon, it escalated into something darker. Cynthia began forcing Rica to carry heavy objects for hours until her tiny arms shook. When she faltered, the punishments grew harsher. The neighbors noticed glimpses of Rica dragging trash cans taller than her, shivering outside while the other children played inside. But they told themselves it wasn't their place to interfere. That's how most tragedies begin, with silence that feels like politeness. Inside, the emotional and physical abuse became routine. Cynthia broke down Rica's spirit methodically, the way an abuser tests the limits of what they can get away with. She isolated her, made her eat alone, tore her dolls apart piece by piece, the same dolls that had once been her safe haven. The symbolism is almost unbearable. The very things she used to protect were now destroyed by the person meant to protect her. Richard saw it all, but did nothing. His silence was permission. His apathy, complicity. Every scream he ignored, every bruise he explained away, gave Cynthia more power. It's important to remember here, this wasn't hidden. Rica's suffering was visible. Teachers saw the changes first, her smiles fading, her energy gone. The bubbly, talkative girl who once raised her hand in every class now sat at her desk in silence. They noticed the bruises on her arms, her legs, her face, and filed reports to Illinois DCFS. But those reports went nowhere. A worker came, checked boxes on a form, no immediate threat, and left. Case closed. Rica was learning, at 8 years old, that the world didn't listen when small voices cried. What's haunting is that these early reports could have changed everything. Teachers begged for intervention. Our mother, from jail, wrote letters warning them that something was wrong. And still, the system's default was inaction. Rica was trapped in plain sight. She began wearing long sleeves even in the summer, her classmates whispering that she looked tired all the time. Once, a teacher offered her a warm coat when she arrived at school without one. Days later, Cynthia stormed into the school, furious, accusing staff of favoritism. That incident should have triggered an emergency review. Instead, it became just another note in a file that no one opened again. Each failure added another layer to the nightmare. And every day, Rica's world grew smaller, her light dimmer, as she realized that even when adults saw, they still might not save you. By the fall of 2018, Rica Roundtree's pain had become impossible to hide, and yet somehow everyone kept pretending not to see it. She was only 8, but she had already learned the art of camouflage, the forced smile, the quiet, "I'm fine," the silence that made adults more comfortable. Her teachers noticed she had stopped playing with her friends. The sparkle in her eyes had dulled to a kind of distant haze, the look children get when they've been punished for crying too often. She had bruises again, this time on her face, her arms, and the soft skin near her neck. One teacher finally said what everyone else was thinking: something is seriously wrong. That report went to DCFS, and once again, a social worker was dispatched. Her name was Patricia Shannon. She met Rica at school, in the nurse's office, where the fluorescent lights made the bruises more visible. "What happened, sweetie?" she asked. Rica's small voice didn't waver as she told the lie she had practiced. "I fell on my toys." Even at 8, she understood that telling the truth wouldn't save her. It would just make the pain worse when she got home. The nurse tried to push for further evaluation, but procedure took over. Shannon noted that Rica seemed timid but cooperative. She wrote that the explanation appeared consistent with accidental injury. She closed her notebook. And with that, another chance to save Rica vanished. Back at home, Cynthia Baker was furious that a teacher had dared to question her. She stormed into the school, yelling at staff, accusing them of overstepping, and demanding that they stay out of her business. The school reported the confrontation, but DCFS didn't escalate it. They called it a parental misunderstanding. What's unbearable about this is that the system had a full history in front of them. Multiple reports. Visible injuries, behavioral red flags, and still. No one acted with urgency. And this wasn't some faceless bureaucratic flaw. These were individuals, human beings, each making the same deadly mistake, assuming someone else would step in. At home, the abuse grew more vicious. Cynthia's punishments became physical endurance tests. Rica was made to hold heavy cans until her arms trembled, to stand for hours in corners until her knees buckled. The other children watched, too frightened to help. Rica Roundtree, her father, sat in the next room, scrolling on his phone, ignoring the sounds coming from the hallway. Rica stopped trying to explain her bruises at school. She stopped trying to explain anything. By December, she was coming to class without a coat in freezing weather. A staff member lent her one, only for Cynthia to arrive the next morning, enraged, demanding it back. Teachers were shaken, but powerless. They had done their part. They had filed reports, called authorities, followed policy. The rest was out of their hands, or so they thought. On December 10, 2018, DCFS received another abuse complaint, this one detailing new bruises around Rica's eyes, both in different stages of healing. That should have triggered an immediate intervention, but instead, the case was logged, reviewed, and delayed over the holidays. The process stalled. No one checked on Rica again. She returned home for winter break and never came back. It's difficult to overstate what those final weeks must have been like for her. Imagine being 8 years old, in pain every day, surrounded by adults who can see it and still choose paperwork over protection. Imagine realizing that your life depends on people who have already decided not to care. Rica's teacher, Mrs. Harris, later said she used to light up the classroom. By spring, it was like she wasn't there anymore. That sentence alone captures everything that went wrong, not in one moment, but in dozens of small, preventable failures. The system didn't miss the signs. It ignored them. By January 2019, winter had settled hard over Bloomington, the kind of cold that cuts through even the thickest coats. But inside the Roundtree home, what was happening to Rica had nothing to do with the weather. It was cruelty that burned instead of froze. Her body was failing, her spirit already frayed. Months of starvation, exhaustion, and violence had left her too weak to play, too tired to pretend. Teachers would later recall that just before winter break, she could barely lift her head in class. Her eyes had lost their light entirely. When she didn't return after the holidays, the absence barely registered with DCFS. They had been called so many times before that one more report didn't seem urgent. But it was urgent. It was her last chance. On the night of January 6, 2019, Rica's small body finally gave out. The day had been full of punishment-forced tasks, endless shouting, and the kind of fear that leaves you hollow. Sometime after dinner, she began vomiting, clutching her stomach, saying she couldn't see clearly. Those were symptoms of severe internal injury damage no child could fake. But instead of calling for help, Cynthia Baker told her to stop faking it. Witnesses later said she ordered Rica to clean the floor where she'd thrown up. Too weak to stand, and when she couldn't, Cynthia's rage erupted again. Her boyfriend, Rica Roundtree, sat by and did nothing, scrolling his phone, letting the sound of his daughter's cries blend into the hum of the television. It's difficult to say when exactly Rica stopped breathing. Sometime before midnight, the silence in that house changed. When Baker finally realized she was gone, she didn't scream or panic. She reportedly looked at the floor and muttered, "Clean that up. It's disgusting." That line, cold and cruel, would later become one of the most horrifying quotes in court, a window into a heart so devoid of empathy that even death was just another inconvenience. When paramedics arrived, it was too late. Rica's body was cold, her skin marked by bruises old and new. The autopsy later revealed more than 60 external injuries and internal trauma so extensive that doctors could barely document it all. Torn intestines, internal bleeding, fluid buildup around her lungs and brain. The cause of death, peritonitis, a fatal infection from blunt force trauma to her abdomen. And here's the thing about peritonitis. It's treatable. If someone had taken her to a hospital when she first started vomiting, she could have been saved. She could have lived. But instead, she was left to die in agony. Every injury she had told a story of missed opportunities. Teachers who reported, but weren't believed. Social workers who visited but didn't intervene. A father who watched but didn't act. The horror of that night wasn't just what Cynthia Baker did. It was how many people had the power to stop her and didn't. 5 days later, DCFS received yet another report after Rica was already dead. It alleged that Richard and Cynthia were still seeing their other children in violation of a safety order. It would be the first time the department moved with speed. Investigators arrived, and within days, all surviving children were removed from the home. But for Rica, there was no second chance, no rescue, no justice yet. Her body was quietly sent for cremation. No funeral, no goodbye, just a line in the file marked deceased. But her story wasn't over. Not yet. Because sometimes the truth refuses to be buried. Investigators digging into Cynthia Baker's phone would soon uncover evidence that would shake an entire community and force everyone who ignored Rica's suffering to finally look her in the eye. When Rica's case file first landed on the desk of McLean County investigators, they expected another tragic story of neglect, a case where the details fade into statistics. But as they began going through the material, what they found was far worse than anyone imagined. There weren't just reports or written statements. There was footage videos no one should ever have to watch. The digital evidence came from Cynthia Baker's iCloud, automatically synced from her phone. Within those files were recordings that documented Rica's life inside that house. The cruelty, the humiliation, the way she was broken down one punishment at a time. These weren't accidents captured by chance. They were deliberate, staged moments of domination. The investigators described the videos as unwatchable. In one, Cynthia screams at Rica as the little girl struggles to carry heavy objects. The camera wobbles slightly, catching Rica's trembling arms and tear-streaked face. Every time she slows down, Cynthia's voice cuts through the air, sharp and cold. Don't stop. You're lazy. You deserve this. In another clip, Cynthia strikes her repeatedly while lecturing her about obedience. Rica's small hands instinctively try to protect her head. And you can hear her whisper, "I'm sorry," over and over until her voice cracks. Investigators sat in stunned silence as they watched. These were not acts of impulse. They were rehearsed, repeated, recorded. One detective later said, it wasn't just violence. It was performance. She wanted control, and the camera was her audience. Even more chilling were the text messages between Cynthia and Rica Roundtree. In them, they discussed Rica as though she were an inconvenience, not a child. Cynthia complained, "I'm tired of her attitude. She needs to learn her place." Richard replied, "Do what you need to do." In another message, she admitted to scaring her on purpose, writing, "She needs to fear me. That's the only way she'll behave." Richard's response was short but damning. Good. Those texts erased any question of ignorance he knew. He always knew. And yet, he chose silence. As the investigation deepened, prosecutors realized they weren't just building a case. They were building a mirror reflecting the worst kind of human apathy. Each photo, each message, each file revealed not just the violence of two adults, but the systemic failures surrounding them. Teachers, social workers, even neighbors had sent warnings. Rica's body had become the final proof of everything ignored. When prosecutors presented the videos to the grand jury, some jurors cried openly. One reportedly had to step out of the room. The footage was more than evidence. It was Rica's testimony from beyond the grave. It showed her pleading, trembling, apologizing for things no child should ever apologize for. And it showed, in horrifying clarity, that her death wasn't sudden. It was the inevitable result of a system that had seen and walked away too many times. The moment those videos became public evidence, everything changed. The community erupted in outrage. Local headlines blared, "8-year-old's abuse caught on video." People demanded accountability, not only for Cynthia and Richard, but for DCFS. The teachers, the caseworkers, everyone who had missed the chance to save her. Vigils began popping up across Illinois. Parents showed up carrying candles, holding signs that read, "Justice for Rica," and "See something. Say something." It was as if the world had finally decided to listen to her voice, even though it was too late. The footage was devastating, but it ensured that no one could look away anymore. On April 24, 2019, police descended on a small Bloomington home and placed Cynthia Baker in handcuffs. There were no tears, no denial, no resistance, just a cold stillness that chilled everyone watching. When officers read her the charges: first-degree murder, aggravated battery, and multiple counts of child abuse, she blinked once, asked for her phone, and muttered that she needed to call work. Even in that moment, she couldn't bring herself to acknowledge what she'd done. Neighbors stood outside, silent, as she was led into the squad car. For months, they had wondered about the shouting, the strange punishments, the way Rica always looked scared. Now, they watched as the reality unfolded in flashing blue and red lights. The same day, police executed a warrant for Rica Roundtree, who was brought in for questioning. Detectives confronted him with the texts, the photos, and the videos. At first, he denied everything said. He didn't know what Cynthia was capable of. But when they read his own words back to him, his "do what you need to do" replies, his defense collapsed. Richard's silence had been as deadly as Cynthia's violence. In that interrogation room, the silence was suffocating. One detective finally said, "You watched her die every day, and you did nothing." Richard didn't respond. He just stared at the table. For the prosecutors, building the case was both horrifying and painfully straightforward. They had the videos, the autopsies, the messages, and the medical evidence. It wasn't just proof of a crime, it was proof of torture. What haunted the investigators most was how preventable it all was. "We failed her," one of them said later. The system, the school, the family, everyone failed her. The community's outrage turned into movement. Parents who had never attended a city meeting before began showing up, demanding reform. They wanted answers from DCFS, the very agency that had visited Rica's home multiple times and walked away. How many boxes had to be checked? How many bruises documented before someone acted? The department issued a statement expressing deep regret, but for many, it was too little, too late. Meanwhile, in a quiet apartment across town, Anjanetta Simmons, Rica's mother, watched the news from her couch. Her daughter's name scrolled across the screen, and all she could think was how many times she'd warned them. She begged caseworkers not to send her daughter to that house. She'd written letters. She'd said the words, "She's not safe," again and again, until no one was listening anymore. Now her worst fear was reality. Rica was gone, and all the mother's intuition in the world couldn't bring her back. When Cynthia Baker's mugshot appeared on the screen, Anjanetta whispered, "That's her. That's the woman who killed my baby." Her voice didn't break. It had already broken long ago. The arrest sparked headlines across Illinois. Reporters called it one of the most disturbing cases in recent memory. Social workers, teachers, and parents alike wrestled with guilt. People wanted to believe Rica's death was an anomaly, but it wasn't. It was a symptom of something much larger, a system that responds to danger only after it's too late. As the legal proceedings began, both defendants were held without bail. Cynthia Baker, unrepentant, continued to deny direct responsibility, claiming Rica had injured herself. Rica Roundtree's defense tried to portray him as a man controlled by an abusive partner, but the evidence said otherwise. He had opportunities to intervene. He didn't. The public wanted more than punishment. They wanted change. Candlelight vigils grew into rallies outside the courthouse. People brought flowers, letters, and drawings from children who barely understood what happened but somehow sensed the weight of it. One poster said, "No child should die waiting to be believed." Those words became the unofficial rallying cry for justice. Rica's story was no longer a tragedy whispered behind doors. It was now a banner held high, demanding accountability. When the trial of Cynthia Baker began, the courthouse felt like a wound, every bench filled with people who couldn't look away, even though every detail would hurt to hear. Reporters described the air as heavy, thick with anger and sorrow. Parents came clutching their children's hands tighter than usual. Teachers from Rica's school sat in silence, still haunted by the bruises they'd seen, the reports they'd filed, and the system that hadn't listened. And at the front of the courtroom sat Anjanetta Simmons, her back straight, her hands trembling, her daughter's photo pinned to her blouse. Across from her, Cynthia Baker, stone-faced, cold, unflinching. If there was remorse in her, it was buried too deep to find. The prosecution's opening statement was blunt. This is not a case about discipline gone too far. This is a case about a child who was tortured to death in her own. Over the next several days, the evidence that followed proved that sentence to be more than rhetoric. They began with medical testimony, clinical but devastating. The coroner described the autopsy results in detail. Over 60 visible scars, fractures, internal bleeding, organ damage, and an intestinal tear that led to fatal peritonitis. The room went silent as he explained how long Rica would have been in pain days before she died. Then came the videos. The prosecution warned the court before playing them. The lights dimmed, the screen flickered, and for several unbearable minutes, the courtroom was forced to witness what Rica had lived through. Cynthia's voice filled the speakers, sharp, mocking, cruel. "You're worthless," she shouted in one clip, while Rica's tiny voice pleaded, "I'm sorry. Please don't." Some jurors covered their mouths. Others looked away, their eyes wet. The judge later said it was one of the few times in her career she'd had to pause a session to let everyone regain composure. Those videos left no room for doubt. They weren't moments of anger. They were acts of sadism. When it was Richard Roundtree's turn in the spotlight, the prosecution revealed the text messages between him and Cynthia. Each line made the room colder. "She's acting up again," Cynthia had written. "Do what you need to," he replied. That exchange repeated week after week, transforming his silence into complicity. He hadn't struck the blows, but he had built the silence that made them possible. Even the defense struggled to craft a narrative that could wash that away. Then came the witnesses' teachers, nurses, neighbors. One by one, they spoke about the things they'd seen but couldn't stop thinking about. "She came to school without a coat in the middle of winter," one teacher said softly. "We gave her one, and the next day she didn't have it anymore." Another recalled seeing bruises on her arms. "We filed reports. We did what we could." But nothing changed. It was a chorus of regret, a haunting refrain of people who had cared but had been drowned out by protocol and paperwork. Finally, Anjanetta took the stand. The courtroom fell still. Her voice trembled as she talked about her daughter, the way Rica used to hum to her dolls, how she loved the color purple, how she called her Mommy Best Friend. And then, through tears, she said the words that cut through everyone in that room. "I begged them not to send her there. I told them she wasn't safe. No one believed me. And now I have to visit my baby at an urn." You could hear sniffles throughout the room. Even the judge's eyes glistened. When it was time for the defense, Cynthia Baker's attorney tried to paint her as someone who had lost control, who didn't mean to kill. But the jury had seen the videos, read the messages, heard the tone of her voice. This wasn't loss of control. It was the use of it. Her cruelty wasn't impulsive. It was practiced. The prosecution reminded the jury of that in their closing statement. She filmed herself because she wanted to remember it. She wanted to watch her power over an 8-year-old child. That's not anger. That's evil. When the trial ended, there was no suspense in the verdict, only gravity. Guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced Cynthia Baker to life in prison without the possibility of parole, calling her actions a stain on humanity. As deputies led her away, she didn't look at the gallery, didn't look at Ancinetta, didn't look at the photo of the little girl whose life she'd destroyed. She simply stared ahead, as expressionless as she'd been from the start. For Richard Roundtree, justice came later, but no less deserved. Faced with overwhelming evidence, he accepted a plea deal for endangering the life of a child, receiving 8 years in prison. To many, it wasn't enough. He had watched it all happen and done nothing. But even 8 years felt like a symbolic acknowledgement that silence is its own kind of violence. When the gavel finally fell for the last time, the courtroom didn't erupt. There was no applause, no triumph, just quiet relief. Justice had come, but at an unbearable cost. When the word guilty echoed through that Illinois courtroom, it didn't sound like closure. It sounded like reckoning. Reporters would later write that the air seemed to collapse in on itself, a silence so heavy that even the hum of the fluorescent lights felt loud. Cynthia Baker, now convicted of the brutal murder of 8-year-old Rica Roundtree, was handed the only sentence that could match the horror of her crime's life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge, her voice trembling with both anger and grief, said, "You robbed a child not only of her life, but of every ounce of safety this world could have given her. You will never walk free again." The courtroom didn't erupt. It exhaled. No one celebrated. There was no victory in seeing a woman led away in chains when the little girl she'd destroyed would never again take a breath. Outside, cameras flashed. Journalists shouted questions that no one wanted to answer. For Rica's mother, Ancinetta Simmons, the verdict brought no comfort. "There's no justice when your child's gone," she told reporters softly, clutching her daughter's framed photo. Justice would have been someone listening before it was too late. Her words struck something deeper than grief. They carried indictment. Not just of Cynthia, but of every layer of bureaucracy that had treated Rica like a statistic instead of a soul. News of the verdict spread quickly, and with it came outrage that bordered on disbelief. People weren't just horrified by what Cynthia Baker had done. They were horrified by how many times the system had almost intervened and still failed. The teachers had reported. The school nurse had documented. DCFS had visited. Yet the paper trail ended in the same place every time. Case closed. What more, people asked, does a child have to endure before someone says, enough? The public demanded answers from the Department of Children and Family Services. Protests began outside the DCFS headquarters. Parents holding signs with messages like "No more Ricas" and "Reform before regret." Former caseworkers spoke up, admitting that overloaded caseloads and underfunded offices led to shortcuts that cost lives. "We saw the signs," one said, "but when you're juggling 50 cases at once, you triage suffering. You decide who might survive another week." That statement alone was enough to spark fury. Legislators took notice. Local representatives began working with child advocacy groups to draft what became informally known as Rica's Law. The proposed bill aimed to reform how the state handles high-risk child abuse cases, mandating follow-up visits within 24 hours of any reported injury, automatic escalation when a history of violence exists in the household, and mandatory background checks for any caregiver taking custody. It wasn't revolutionary policy. It was common sense made urgent by a child's death. Still, it marked something unprecedented. A government finally admitting that a system had blood on its hands. Meanwhile, the other half of Rica's tragedy, the part named Rica Roundtree reached its own conclusion. Facing the mountain of evidence that proved he knew about the abuse and allowed it to continue, he pleaded guilty to endangering the life of a child. His sentence, 8 years in prison. To the public, it felt insultingly small. To Anjanetta, it felt like betrayal all over again. He watched her suffer, she said. 8 years isn't justice, it's mercy. But even that small measure of accountability mattered. It sent a signal that silence, too, could be punished. For the community, the case became something larger than one family's nightmare. Churches held vigils, schools created mandatory child safety seminars, and parents started conversations they'd been too afraid to have. People who had once believed, "It's not my business," began to understand that inaction has consequences. In every corner of Bloomington, people whispered Rica's name not as gossip, but as promise. On the courthouse steps after sentencing, hundreds gathered holding candles. As the sun set, they began to sing softly, a lullaby that Anjanetta used to hum to her daughter. The melody rose through the cold evening air, carrying words of both mourning and defiance. For the first time, it felt like the world was listening to Rica's voice, even if it came through the collective grief of those she left behind. In the months after the sentencing, Illinois entered a period of quiet reckoning. The trial was over, but the questions lingered like an ache the state couldn't ignore. How did a little girl with visible bruises, concerned teachers, and multiple reports to child services still end up dead? The more people learned about Rica's case, the clearer it became that this wasn't just a story about one monster in a home. It was about many small silences that added up to tragedy. And at the heart of that reckoning was one woman who refused to let her daughter's story fade. Anjanetta Simmons, a mother who had lost everything except her voice. Anjanetta could have retreated, disappeared from the public eye, and no one would have blamed her. But grief, when fused with purpose, can move mountains. In 2020, she began partnering with advocacy groups, legislators, and journalists determined to expose every crack that had failed her daughter. She didn't speak like a politician. She spoke like a mother, a voice raw, unpolished, but impossible to ignore. "They looked at my record," she told a news crew once, "not my instincts. They called me unfit when I was the only one who knew she wasn't safe." That line became the rallying cry of a movement, working with state lawmakers. Anjanetta helped draft what would be called Rica's Law Reform Bill that demanded accountability from child welfare agencies. It proposed faster response times, follow-up visits within 24 hours after abuse reports, and independent oversight to prevent case closures without confirmation of safety. For the first time in years, the halls of the Illinois Capitol echoed with something more powerful than bureaucracy remorse. Lawmakers, social workers, and even former DCFS employees testified in favor of the bill. They admitted the truth that everyone had avoided saying out loud: Rica should still be alive. The movement didn't stay confined to Illinois. Advocacy groups across the Midwest began adopting Rica's Promise Pledges community programs encouraging teachers, neighbors, and relatives to take personal responsibility for reporting and following up on signs of child abuse. People started realizing that protection doesn't end with filing a report. It starts with persistence. Back in Bloomington, Anjanetta began hosting community vigils every January, marking the day her daughter's light went out. She called it the Night of Small Candles. Each year, more people came: parents, social workers, police officers, even some of the teachers who had once filed those early reports and carried the guilt ever since. They stood together in the freezing air, holding candles as Anjanetta read from her daughter's favorite book, The Velveteen Rabbit. She always stopped at the same passage. Once you are real, you can't become unreal again. It lasts for always. To her, those words meant Rica's story would never be forgotten. By 2021, National media outlets began covering the case again, not as breaking news, but as an emblem of a larger truth. The system designed to protect children was itself broken. Editorials called for increased funding for social workers, training to spot manipulation by abusive parents, and laws ensuring children's voices are heard even when they can't speak for themselves. Rica had become a symbol not of death, but of reform. Her face, once hidden behind headlines, now represented hope that change could come from pain. Even with all this progress, the cost weighed heavy on Ancinetta. In interviews, she often admitted, "Every law passed feels like a piece of her I get to give back to the world. But it also reminds me of what it took to make people listen." That duality, grief and triumph, became the legacy of her daughter's short life. Rica's laughter, once silenced, now echoed in every policy debate, every child advocacy workshop, every candlelit vigil. And while laws and movements can never bring back the child they're named for, they can build walls strong enough to keep others safe. That's what Ancinetta wanted. Not sympathy, not headlines change. Because she knew better than anyone that monsters thrive in silence, but systems collapse under scrutiny. If Rica's story forced people to see what they'd ignored before, then maybe, just maybe, her death could save another child's life. There's a moment after every tragedy when the world has to decide what comes next, whether to move on and forget or to carry the memory forward like a torch. For Rica Roundtree, that decision was made by everyone who refused to let her story disappear. The system that failed her may have been slow to change, but her name now lives in classrooms, in community centers, in policy debates where people once looked away. She became more than a victim. She became a voice for every child whose cries were ignored, every bruise that was explained away, every warning that died in a file drawer. The same state that once stamped "case closed" beside her name now uses it to open new cases faster, investigate deeper, and question harder. And it all began with one mother who turned her grief into fire. When you walk through certain towns in Illinois now, you'll see her name on flyers for child safety workshops, on posters in school hallways that read, "See something, say something, do something." You'll hear her name in the soft prayers at vigils each January, when hundreds of candles burn against the winter wind. Every light flickering in that cold darkness carries a promise: never again. At one of those vigils, Ancinetta once said, "When I close my eyes, I don't see her dying. I see her laughing, and I want the world to remember that part." That's what love does. It reclaims what cruelty tried to erase. Rica's story teaches us something uncomfortable, but necessary. Evil doesn't always scream. Sometimes it whispers through routine, through unchecked authority, through the quiet moments when people choose not to get involved. The signs were there. The warnings were written. And yet, every adult in her world, teachers, social workers, even her own father, became part of the silence that killed her. But silence doesn't have to win. Every time someone speaks up now because of her, every time a teacher insists on a second investigation, every time a neighbor makes that uncomfortable call, it's her voice echoing through theirs. For Ancinetta, that's how her daughter lives on. Not through headlines, but through prevention. Through the courage of strangers who refuse to let another child become another file. The truth is, protecting children isn't just a government duty. It's a human one. It's the responsibility of anyone who sees something that doesn't feel right. Anyone who senses a child's fear and refuses to rationalize it away. The cost of hesitation is too high. Rica taught that in the hardest way imaginable. In the end, this isn't just a story about justice. It's a story about awakening. About realizing that the measure of a society isn't in how it punishes the guilty, but in how it protects the innocent before harm is done. If even one person, one law, one act of vigilance saves a child because of her, then her short life will have rewritten something permanent in all of us. So when you see a candle burning in a window, on a winter night, or a playground swing moving softly in the wind. Think of her. Think of the laughter that once filled the room and the silence that followed, and promise yourself that you'll never let that silence win again. Asterisk. Rica Roundtree's story reminds us that protecting a child is not just an act of love, it's an act of courage. Systems can fail, but people don't have to. Every time we speak up, report, question, or intervene, we become the wall between a child and their abuser. Don't wait for permission to care. Don't assume someone else will handle it. Love loudly, act early, and never let silence be the last word.